3 hours. Tradition says that's how long Jesus hung on the cross. 3 hours, and then silence. It is finished. Silence. Jesus bows his head and releases his final breath, and silence. Silence is the sound of death. Silence leads to death. Silence follows death. Last Saturday, I stood with 13 of our youth and 800,000 others on Pennsylvania Avenue as Emma Gonzalez stepped to the mic. 6 minutes and about 20 seconds, she said. In a little over 6 minutes, 17 of our friends were taken from us. 15 were injured, and everyone, absolutely everyone in the Douglas community was forever altered. Everyone who was there understands. Everyone who has been touched by the cold grip of gun violence understands. For us, long, tearful, chaotic hours in the scorching afternoon sun were spent not knowing. No one understood the extent of what had happened. No one could believe that there were bodies in that building waiting to be identified for over a day. No one knew that the people who were missing had stopped breathing long before any of us had even known that a code red had been called. No one could comprehend the devastating aftermath or how far this would reach or where this would go. For those who still can't comprehend because they refuse to, I'll tell you where it went, right into the ground, 6 feet deep. Emma continued, charging through her speech as if sheer momentum could overwhelm the searing pain of loss. 6 minutes and 20 seconds with an AR-15. And my friend Carmen would never complain to me about piano practice. Aaron Feiss would never call Kira Miss Sunshine. Alex Schachter would never walk into school with his brother Ryan. Scott Beagle would never joke around with Cameron at camp. Helena Ramsey would never hang around school with Max. Gina Montalto would never wave to her friend Liam at lunch. Joaquin Oliver would never play basketball with Sam or Dylan. Elena Petty would never. Kara Lundgren would never. Chris Hickson would never. Luke Hoyer would never. Martine Duque Anguiano would never. Peter Wang would never. Alyssa Alhadoff would never. Jamie Guttenberg would never. Meadow Pollack would never. And then Emma did something remarkable, something transformational and holy and simple. Emma Gonzalez stood in silence, jaw set, ferocity in her eyes, tears rolling down her cheeks. She could have screamed. She could have wailed. She could have torn new orifices in every politician who has refused to act, every stockholder in a weapons manufacturer who has cashed a check, every one of us who has refused to raise our voices to protect our children. God knows she is capable of doing that, and yet instead of bringing the noise, Emma brought silence. Because that's what death is. Death is silence. Silence is the sound of death. Silence leads to death. Silence follows death. At first, people shouted encouragement, thinking she had been overcome by emotion and unable to continue. Then, as the discomfort of the silence began to sink in, and silence is uncomfortable, the crowd began to chant, "Never again, never again, never again." But this was not about moving on. This was not about a better tomorrow. This was about the moment. This was about the moment of death. And so still Emma stood in silence. The chants faded out, and the crowd began to understand, and we entered into the silence together, into all its devastation, all its pain. We entered into the silence in all its hopelessness and unbelievability, all its desolation and emptiness, all its would never. 800,000 of us standing on Pennsylvania Avenue. The road where the Army of the Potomac once paraded, celebrating the end of the Civil War, and where 60 years later, 40,000 Ku Klux Klan members marched to try to relitigate the outcome. Silence. The road on which President Kennedy marched from the Capitol after challenging us to ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country, and on which a horse-drawn carriage pulled his body, blown apart by a bullet, back to that Capitol fewer than 3 years later. Silence. The road where a century ago Alice Paul led the National American Woman Suffrage Association in a protest march to demand the right to vote, and a year ago 500,000 women and allies marched to say that even though a woman had been denied the presidency despite winning the popular vote, they were not going anywhere. Silence. On that road where presidents had walked and protesters had chanted, where the U.S. Army had paraded and down which armies of lobbyists had marched, 800,000 images of God stood in silence. It has been called the loudest silence in the history of U.S. social protest. And perhaps it was. But it did not stand alone, and in that moment, neither did we. For the silence in that moment was not just the silence of the 6 minutes and 20 seconds of the 17 dead classmates and teachers. It was the silence after British Colonel Reginald Dyer directed 15 minutes of continuous British fire into a crowd of women, children, and men in a public garden in Punjab, massacring more than 1,000 of them. It was the silence of the smoke coming from Auschwitz and Buchenwald. The silence after Tutsi infants were dashed against the stone walls of a church in Nyamata, Rwanda. The silence of Hue and My Lai. The silence of Jonestown and the MOVE bombing in Philadelphia. The silence of Tiananmen Square and Kent State. It was the silence that descends from the cross as the God of our weary years, the God of our silent tears, breathes God's final breath. Emma brought silence because that's what death is. Death is silence. Silence is the sound of death. Silence leads to death. Silence follows death. Harriet Tubman releases her final breath. Silence. The gunshot that felled Oscar Romero echoes into history. Silence. Michael Brown lies in the street for 4.5 hours. Silence. George Zimmerman executes Trayvon Martin. Howie Lake and Blaine Salamone execute Alton Sterling. Stephon Clark is executed holding a cell phone in his grandmother's backyard. A prison guard hangs Sandra Bland in a cell for the crime of being a woman of color who dared to speak her mind. Silence. Bodies at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School waiting to be identified for over a day. Silence. John Garner, Gil Spear, Zelda Kennedy, our mothers, our fathers, our children, our friends, our lovers, our counselors. There is a final word. There is a final breath. And then there is silence. Jesus says, "It is finished," bows his head, gives up his spirit. Silence. Would never, would never, would never. We have moments of silence to contemplate death, to remember the dead, but the truth is silence is the sound of death. It is the sound of nothingness, no breath, no life, nothing. In her memoir about caring for her comatose daughter, Isabel Allende wrote, "Silence before being born, silence after death. Life is nothing but noise between two unfathomable silences. And whether life is sound and fury signifying nothing or signifying everything, when it is over, and all that is left is would never. All that is left is the silence." Jesus bowed his head and gave up his spirit, and there was silence. Silence that is isolation more than solitude. Silence that used to be the breathing coming from the other side of the bed. Silence that is a church without children. Silence that we fear so much we will fill the space with anything we can to try to chase it away. Silence where we are left to hope and trust that, like Elijah, God will be present in the midst of it, that God will come to us in the sound of sheer silence, where there is nothing, nothing at all. Silence is the sound of death. It is the report of the gun echoing away, the last word, the final exhale. Silence leads to death. It is the silence of our friends that Dr. King reminds us, in the end, we will remember more than the words of our enemies. The silence that Audre Lorde cautions us will not protect us. The silence that equaled death during the Third Reich, the AIDS epidemic, and in black and brown America today. Silence follows death. There was silence on the cross that day. There will be silence after you. There will be silence after me. There is silence as we stand at the foot of the cross. Jesus says, "It is finished," bows his head, gives up his spirit. Silence. Would never, would never, would never.